This is Glenn Fulcher with another issue of Language Testing Bites. In the last 5 years, Brent, Bridgeman and Yeonsuk of Educational Testing Service in the United States have published 3 innovative articles on predictive validity in language testing. This has long been a very problematic area in the field, and so it's fascinating to see new approaches being developed to understand just what predictive value to performance in future domains our tests might have. Brent and Yeonsuk have kindly agreed to talk to me in this podcast to explore some of the issues that we all have to tackle, especially when we are trying to predict the likelihood of success in areas such as higher education. Welcome to Language Testing Bites, and thanks very much for agreeing to come and talk to us about predictive validity.
And thank you for inviting us. We're really excited to share our thoughts about predictive validity with you today.
Well, can I begin by asking you to tell us what predictive validity is and why you've put so much effort into researching predictive validity over a considerable number of years now. So what is it and why is it important?
Predictive validity tells us how well a test predicts a criterion we care about. For college admissions tests, the criterion is often the grades that students earn in their college courses. Grades are not a perfect criterion, but they do indicate an important judgment by college faculty on the extent to which the student has mastered the content of the course. Another criterion might be whether the students completed their programs. And sometimes time to degree is used as a criterion in predictive validity studies. But this criterion is often not very well predicted from test scores because external personal factors, things like getting married, or financial difficulties can extend the time to degree, and these factors have nothing to do with the language abilities that are measured on the test. Predictive validity is important because it is one way to show the value of a test. Suppose a test that was used as part of the selection process for college students had no relationship to how well students actually did when they got to college. There would then be no justification for using the test. But if students who do well on the test also tend to do well in college, then the test has demonstrated value in the admissions process.
Thanks for that. Now, in your recent articles in language testing, you do point out that correlations between language tests and criteria in the academic domain are usually very low. And this has plagued language testers for a long time. And Alan Davis was always particularly concerned about this. So, for example, in the 1975 paper on speeded reading tests, he writes, "Predictive validity puts all the onus of decision on the criterion, and it is well known how unreliable and often invalid they are. And, of course, grades for foreign students often sink to an R of 0.2 with an English language predictor. Even 0.6, which is by no means unsatisfactory, is really very small when you remember how much of the variance, all of which in this case is language, is unexplained." Well, I think that's a fantastic quotation, and it's as true today as it was then. So why is it that the relation between language test scores and the criteria for academic success are generally so weak?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have a way of knowing or ever finding out the true correlation between language proficiency and academic success. No one will disagree that we must know the language to be able to learn content subjects at school. For example, even if we study a subject like math, which is generally believed to involve the least amount of language, we still use the language to explain mathematical problems to other people. This is why many schools require their prospect students to demonstrate a certain level of language proficiency. So scores on language tests are used to screen out those students who are not linguistically ready. But this creates a problem for us researchers as we try to determine the relationship between language ability and academic success. Because those who are not fluent in language do not get admitted to school. We don't have data on them, so we do not know how they might have done academically if they had been admitted. So predictive validity study begins with a data that are limited in this regard, suppressing the correlation that we might observe if data weren't restricted. Another reason why we often do not see a high correlation is that once individuals reach a threshold for a language, the role of language diminishes amongst the influences of other factors. For example, factors like a personality, motivation, or grit, which is often discussed nowadays in education, come into play. So students with a strong desire to do well at school are likely to put more effort in getting good grades. Also, differences in grading practice among faculty, disciplines, and universities influence the criterion that we try to predict with a language score. So these are just a few examples, but there are a lot of factors that prevent us from understanding the role of language in academic success.
In your 2016 paper, you specifically address one of the issues that you've just mentioned, that of combining data across different programs. Now, in that paper, you use the metaphor of peeling the onion. You suggest that various variables such as academic major or type of educational system that students have experienced might have an impact on the size of correlations between test scores and criteria. Can you talk us through how you investigated this hypothesis?
So to evaluate the predictive validity of the TOEFL IBT, we first looked at how well the total score in each of the 4 sections, that is listening, reading, speaking, and writing, predicted college grades when all of the students were combined in a single group. But we knew that grading standards could be different in different departments, and that the relative importance of each of the 4 skills might be different in different departments. When all of the students were in a single group, the reading and writing scores were the best predictors, and their correlation with first-year grades, adjusted for range restriction, were 0.22 and 0.24 for reading and writing, respectively. We then looked separately at students enrolled in different academic departments. For example, when we looked at students in the business school separately, the correlation for reading was only 0.13, while the writing correlation was 0.31. This relatively low correlation for reading was a somewhat surprising result. So we wanted to peel another layer off the onion by looking at student groups within the business school. Almost half of the international students in the business school were from China. And when we separated these students from the others, a very different picture emerged. Reading was the best predictor for the non-Chinese students with a correlation of 0.28, compared to the essentially zero correlation for the Chinese students. On the other hand, writing was an amazingly good predictor for the students from China, with an adjusted correlation of 0.56. The pattern in the Chinese students seemed odd, especially the essentially zero correlation for the reading score. So we peeled another layer off the onion by further splitting the Chinese group. We noticed that some of the Chinese students had a very atypical pattern among the 4 section scores, with a very strong performance in the reading and listening sections, but very weak scores in the productive skills of speaking and writing. Although only about 14% of the Chinese students had this atypical pattern, when they were removed from the analysis, the results changed dramatically. The correlation for the reading score jumped from essentially zero to a very robust 0.36. All of these correlations I have mentioned were corrected for range restriction. We don't know why some students had a large discrepancy between their productive and receptive skills, but this should be an interesting area for further research.
Now, there's just one technical issue that I'd like to ask you about. Can you briefly explain for the listeners what you mean by adjusting correlations for the range of restriction, and how do you do that?
The adjustment for range restriction is necessary because the only grades we have as a criterion measure come from students who are already admitted. These students represent just the higher end of the total applicant pool. But what we really want to know is how well the test would work for all the applicants, not just those who are ultimately admitted. The correction for range restriction is a well-known statistical adjustment that allows us to estimate what the correlation would be among all applicants, and not just those who are ultimately admitted.
So I guess that my last question is about the relevance of these findings for key stakeholders. I mean, if I were a university admissions tutor, what are the key take-home messages that you'd give me?
So the key take-home message is that if you want to understand the value of an admissions test, you need to look at meaningful subgroups within your total student population. A test that appears to be of just marginal value when all students are lumped together may actually be seen to have substantial value in each of the subgroups when they're evaluated separately. Also, for tests such as the TOEFL that has separate scores in different skill areas, it is wise to look at these skill areas separately for different subgroups, as opposed to just looking at the total score. The total score allows students with very weak skills in one area to compensate with a very high score in another area. But this compensation may not be a good thing if some minimal score level on each area is necessary for successful performance at the university. In short, just looking at predictions for the total score for all students combined gives you an easy answer to the value of the test, but it may be the wrong answer.
Well, thank you for talking to us about predictive validity on language testing bites. This is a really important issue for score interpretation and use, and I'm sure that there are many other researchers who will get ideas from your papers and from this podcast about how they could investigate the predictive validity of their own tests. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening to this issue of Language Testing Bites. Language Testing Bites is a production of the journal Language Testing from Sage Publications. You can subscribe to Language Testing Bites through iTunes, or you can download future issues from ltj.sagepub.com or from languagetesting.info. So until next time, we hope you have enjoyed the current issue of Language Testing Bites.